Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she and her.
And I'm Reverend Ingrid, and my pronouns are she, her.
In this episode, we'll discuss the second Sunday after Epiphany, which is also known as Lectionary 2, which this year falls on January 16th. We do have one content notification for you this episode, which is that during the deep dive, we discuss alcoholism and substance use.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So today, our deep dive is on alcohol and alcoholism. And for our deep dive, we have our special guest, Reverend Ingrid Brown, who is a minister in the United Church of Canada. She is the founding pastor of Weird Church, a new community formed in 2018 in Cumberland, British Columbia, on Vancouver Island. And we are so glad to have you join us today. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey into your specialized and so necessary work?
Well, thank you for having me with you today. I'm a fellow nerd at church and church nerd. So my journey in the work actually started quite a while ago with my journey into addiction. And so I started using and abusing substances at a really young age, so that by 12 or 13, I was already pretty well on my way to addiction. So then the 7 or 8 years that followed were this mess of self-will and destruction, self-destruction, others' destruction, and really spiritual desperation. So by some small miracle, I did manage to finish high school and acting school in New York City. Yeah. And then it was when I was 20 years old that my mom came from our little small town in Canada and peeled me up off the sidewalk and brought me home back to our tiny little town to sober up. And I've been clean and sober since October 2nd, 2004. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, and I found recovery in 12-step groups. And one of the things with 12-step recovery is that you have to give it away to keep it. So someone with 30 days clean can help someone with 1 day. And so service in the recovery community started right away. So I've been active in that community for 17 years. And so I've worked with hundreds of cis and trans women in recovery and treatment centers and in the local community. And since working in ministry, since becoming an ordained minister, that number really went up because, well, I think for two reasons. One is that it doesn't hurt to do recovery work with someone who is both a minister and also understands the language of it and who has walked through it. Yeah. But really, I think the good news that we find in the gospel, the good news of forgiveness, of healing and new life, is really thirst quenching for those of us who could never find a place to quench that thirst, to satisfy that thirst. So I want to make clear that in my work, I don't typically advertise that I'm a recovering drug addict and alcoholic. It's not like something I stand up at the front on Sundays and talk about, but I also don't keep it a secret when it comes to work that can happen in the community or within my own community of faith. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. For the folks I know who are in recovery, there are some people who are very private about it, and a lot of pastors and ministers who are in recovery walk different lines in that of being really open about being in recovery and public about it, because that's part of their call, both in terms of recovery and in terms of their call to ministry. Yeah. So it's a delicate dance, I think, and one that you have to do with intentionality, but it can be such a gift for other folks in recovery to have someone who's a pastor or a faith leader who's in recovery.
Well, I think the other thing too is it's so contextual, right? So Weird Church is a community that is probably 30% of the community is in recovery in some way. Probably 40% are in the LGBTQ2+ community. Like, it's a really, really affirming, really engaging community of, and I never called them weirdos. They called themselves weirdos. But that's how members describe themselves. And so, like, we're a community of people that identify as on the margins in some way. And so it's also part of the identity of that community.
Yeah. I mean, biblically, and with the history of our faith, that is like the origins of Christianity are on the margins, not.
I think given the topic of our deep dive today, it would make sense for Emily and I to also give a little background about our own relationships with alcohol. Personally speaking, I decided that I was never going to start drinking probably around the age of 10 or 12 because my family has a extraordinarily terrible history with that. I grew up understanding that my family included both drunks and alcoholics, in that alcoholics go to meetings. And I had very few examples of healthy relationships with alcohol as a child. And so I just decided to not engage. And given that I was later diagnosed with ADHD, which brings along with it a variety of impulse control problems, it turns out that was probably a good idea. So,
yeah. I grew up with pretty healthy models of alcohol consumption and a little bit of other substance use that impacted the ways people lived, but not in terms of anything that's like officially classified as addiction in my family. And then in my like circles of family and chosen family and close friends, I have several people in those circles who are in recovery, as well as people who are in other 12-step programs like Al-Anon and CODA. And so like am familiar with the language and have done some of my own research in seminary and other places, but not familiar on that sort of personal level, which is why we're extra glad to have you with us.
yeah.
Yeah. So alcoholism and substance use disorders have been understood in a variety of ways throughout history, with the most recent, and I think that there's still, culturally, I think we're still shifting towards this, but understanding them as an illness and decidedly not a moral failing. Can you tell us a little bit about how it's understood, both in terms of like a secular medical psychological perspective and from a theological or faith perspective in your experience?
Yeah, so my personal understanding would be that addiction is a physical and a spiritual illness. And from all that I've witnessed and experienced and lived and walked through with other people, it seems to have a lot of roots in trauma and codependency. So, like AA, 12-step recovery, evolving medical models of addiction looks at it as an allergy, but not in the traditional sense, not like I drink alcohol, I break out in hives, but as an abnormal reaction. So if you think about like most people can eat a strawberry, goes through the digestive system. Someone with an allergy to strawberries has an abnormal reaction. So they're going to break out in hives. It's not the hives that we're talking about with the allergy, it's the abnormal reaction. So like if you're thinking about substance use or overuse, it might be, someone, actually, this was the way I came to understand it, was a friend of mine that I grew up with. She would have a glass of wine, maybe two, and then she would go, oh, I'm starting to feel this a little bit. I better stop and slow down and have a cup of coffee. Whereas if someone who struggles with addiction, that substance behaves abnormally in that allergy way. But sorry, I did air quotes. It's a podcast. That's not helpful.
I mean, you could kind of hear the air quotes.
There you go.
A little bit, yeah.
But someone with that allergy has a glass of wine, and then they want another glass of wine, and this phenomenon of craving kicks in, where the glass of wine wants a glass of wine, wants a glass of wine, wants something more, and then it scientifically, there's this acetone reaction in your body that actually is physiologically different, where it just creates this phenomenon of craving. And if that was it, we would just not drink. Like someone who is allergic to strawberries just doesn't eat strawberries, right? Or and if they do by accident, they find out very quickly, like, oh yeah, right, no, I can't eat these strawberries. But the other part, the psychological piece to this model, is that the alcoholic or addict has a sense of self-delusion, so that we tell ourselves, oh, it's going to be different this time, or I'm only going to have this many, or if I leave my bank card at home and only take cash, I'll only be able to do this much. And no matter how much evidence we have to the contrary, we convince ourselves. So there's this self-delusion that happens. The AA has the text, the primary text for it is called the Big Book, colloquially. And there's this story of a jaywalker in it that they use as essentially a parable to teach about addiction, where this guy goes out and jaywalks a couple times. He sort of gets this thrill of jaywalking in the city, and he's out and about, and he has a couple of near misses, right? Where like it's thrilling for him. And then one time he gets hit and breaks an arm, and I forget exactly the parable, but I'll give you the gist of it. He breaks an arm, and people go, "Whoa, you should really, just use crosswalks." And he goes, "Yeah, absolutely." And then gets out of the hospital with his cast and breaks his other arm, and then this carries on, and he keeps swearing to his family that he's going to stop and he's just going to use designated crosswalks. And then eventually he ends up fracturing his skull, and he's in the hospital for months, and he goes through rehab, he gets out, and then within 2 weeks he's got both of his legs broken. And it seems insane to everybody else except an addict or alcoholic is like, well, yeah, how could you give up jaywalking like that, right? You can't just give it up. But
Right.
I do want to just jump into the theological piece, because I remember I came to faith right in the sort of depths of my addiction, and I read Romans 7, and Paul goes, "I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do." And that I was like, yes, somebody gets it. And it was those steps that were in the walls of a church that actually led me into recovery, because I realized there was other people who understood it. So I think there's actually this wider human understanding of what it means to, like, oh, I just don't want to do this thing, but I keep doing it. And addicts and alcoholics cross into this place where the substance, the chemical substance, takes over. And so it's I think a human struggle, but ultimately becomes a chemical dependence for some of us. But ultimately we all struggle in some way with something.
Yeah, that's a really helpful. I hadn't, I've read Romans 7 before, obviously, because, pastor Bible stuff. And Lutherans and Romans are like super buddy. But I hadn't, as you were reading it, I was like, oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way. That is, yeah, of course. That's brilliant.
It's not my idea. I'm sure it came from someone else. It just is floating around in my brain. But it does, 12-step recovery talks about being powerless over alcohol or other mood or mind altering substances. And the whole goal of the 12 steps is to find a power greater than ourselves. And that's basically essentially what Paul's always talking about, right? We are without power, and it is God. It is God who brings us power, God who brings us home, who brings us wholeness. Yeah.
Come to think of it, I think the other group of people who I've read that passage from Romans 7 with, who really found it very powerful, was kids just starting their journey through puberty.
Ooh.
Because the hormones, make you into a different person and
make things happen in your body that you might not expect.
And suddenly you are doing things that you did not expect. And so they have to take it pretty slow the first time through, because Paul's grammar is always kind of weird. But they've always found
I have
to
go get my
so
13-year-old to go read this right now. I'll be right back.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, and so speaking of that theological note, one of the times, speaking of those middle school students, that I was very surprised by having someone bring up addiction in a conversation was when I was teaching a class with middle school students on the commandment of "you shall have no other gods before me." And the student I was talking to immediately brought up addiction, and does addiction break that commandment? And I immediately said to myself, there's about 5 million different landmines in this conversation, and I don't want to land on any of them.
Yep.
So if you wanted to address that a little bit, I would love that.
I appreciate, I forget which one of you said it at the beginning, but that substance abuse and overuse isn't a moral failing, right? But we might understand that in the recovery community, or in certain religious understandings of it, or in medical understandings of it. But there is still that cultural piece, right, that sees addicts as somehow less than. And so I always want to talk, I want to tread very carefully in this arena when we talk about like commandments or sinfulness, because even the way we understand sin is so different. And it's like we need a little asterisk with with like a side comment of like, here's what I mean when I'm talking about sin, because we come with cultural baggage and baggage
Yeah.
from our upbringing or our different traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, both my parents are Lutheran, but from different synods. And so my grandparents understand my ordination very differently.
Ooh.
Yeah. So,
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
um,
goodness. Yeah.
so I do want to sort of, I would recommend treading carefully through all this, because I think if we talk about addiction in terms of moral failing or sin or commandment breaking, it's a really quick jump to further isolate people who are already carrying around like just a truckload of guilt and shame. But that said, I do think it's breaking that commandment,
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
but in the way that I understand it is
Sure.
like we all break this commandment all the time. And I think in our climate, our culture
Mm-hmm.
right now,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
this is probably the one that we just kind of break all over the place. So if we think about it in terms of like making sure that God is God and nothing else is God, and yet I like even as a pastor, I can easily slip into like busyness in that top slot, or fear of financial insecurity, or study, right? I can even get caught in like, if I just know enough
Sure.
things, I'm going to be able to do my job better. And even that probably is in there, even though it's got great intentions.
Sure.
But that said, having it framed in, I made, I did put something other than God in that God spot in my priority list, caused everything else to fall apart. And when I keep God in that right spot, everything else is okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of think that maybe because there's those 5 million landmines in that conversation, that's part of what makes that conversation so powerful. In that having this conversation, if done carefully, could be a great way to illustrate the difference between, our sense of religion and God and sin versus that
Mm-hmm.
other sense of religion and God and sin that is so prevalent out there.
I have heard a lot of language of like, right, like what the role of your higher power is and the limitations of ourselves from folks who are in 12-step programs. And so that space too, I think, is a really interesting one. And like you both have said, right, it's a very, very light treading in this space, especially for me as someone who's not in recovery, who doesn't deal with addiction in the same way. But like that space of when we put ourselves in the place of God. So both in terms of like we can do it as pastors, we can do it as anybody can replace God and put something else in the place of God, whether it's money or work or whatever. There's also the like the piece that it feels like it would be really powerful is the place of when we put ourselves in the place of God in terms of thinking that we can do recovery on our own, that we have the ability and the power to do it on our own, that it can be that's when it, like from what I have heard, that's when it doesn't work, right? Like you have to give up the idea that you have control over this, because it's exactly that you don't have control over it that is how it is.
Well, it's essentially how we do Christianity too, right? It is in the turning over of our lives that we
Yeah.
receive life, right? And yeah, and that I don't think I can be a Christian by myself. I don't think that's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot on this podcast, I think, of like the need for community. So many denominations have different approaches to alcohol in worship, fellowship, and on the premises, and many are still trying to figure out what is best. And there are plenty of denominations and congregations that just do terribly and don't seem to care. But for folks who are part of communities who want to be inviting and supportive, what are your suggestions for making a space and a community as inviting and as supportive as possible?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great and important question. And where I've seen it work really well is in the seminary I went to. I went to the Vancouver School of Theology, and it's a seminary for Anglicans, Episcopalians, and Presbyterians and United Church of Canada ministers. So There's a school for interreligious studies. There's the indigenous religious program. There's Catholics and Baptists, and there's a whole slew of people. So there's all these traditions that come together, some that use wine in sacraments and some that use grape juice. So the United Church of Canada, one of our forming denominations is the Methodists. So typically in United churches, you're going to get grape juice.
Sure.
Unless some will do it on Christmas Day communion as wine, just a few.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Or Easter Sunday morning. But across the board, you mostly just get grape juice in the United Church. And so in seminary, where there was all of these different denominations coming together, when we worshiped together, there would be the bread, and then there were multiple cups following the bread. So
Sure.
wine was white wine, so that you knew that it was different. Then the grape juice was red. And then there was a common cup of wine. So you could either dip your bread in the wine or, see, I know the word is intinction, but we call it rip and dip sometimes. And so
my grandpa used to call it dip
there
and
you
dash.
go, exactly. Yeah. And so, I mean, these days we're not really doing much of all this. We're back to the tiny little cups, but that was a really nice way of doing it, because then it wasn't a matter of, oh, I have to walk up to the chalice, which I've done in like Anglican situations where I won't receive the common cup. I'll just put my hand on the cup and then receive the wafer. But it does have this like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing kind of feeling. But I didn't start going to all these different kinds of denominations until I was already several years clean and sober. So I already felt confident. I don't know what it would be like as someone who was becoming sober in the midst of a tradition that used wine, where I had to learn how to refuse and then go, oh no, if I put my hand on the cup, does that mean I'm going to get this like weird pastoral phone call later of like, oh, I see you didn't take the cup today, you know? So using grape juice in worship for sacraments takes away some of what I would perceive as potential stress or threat. That said, there's other people in the recovery community who take wine in sacraments and it doesn't affect their sobriety because they're like, this is Jesus, not wine. So it's a really, there isn't one simple way, but having the multiple options for having just grape juice has been really a way to be inclusive for me, in the same way that, you know, my daughter's celiac, and I remember one day that we went to a new church and we were going up to the front for communion, and she's like, oh my gosh, are they going to know? Is it crackers? What if they touch the crackers to the bread? And to see her shoulders up by her ears in this fear of a 6-year-old walking to Christ's table, like, I don't want to create.
That's not what communion's about.
So
yeah.
if I can be in a place where people aren't walking to the table fearfully, but are walking enthusiastically, then I'm achieving something. I mean, all that said, outside of Sunday services, you know, at clergy gatherings, there's usually wine flowing, but
yeah,
whatever
and
else,
beer.
But
yeah. So for the last like 4 or so years, I've done a lot of pulpit supply, and I've done very minimal pulpit supply in person in the last 2 years because pandemic.
Sure.
Right. I did do one that was a live stream in the summer, and they had the little like to go wafer cup combos, but nobody had told me. Like they had said this one is gluten and this one is gluten free. So I knew that part, but I didn't know what the liquid was. And so when I was giving them out to people, one person asked, like they really like it was for other reasons, but they asked like if there was alcohol or not alcohol. And I had to say, I don't know, because nobody had told me that. Right. And I didn't, in that particular case, like normally it's really obvious because, you know, we have the tray of grape juice in the center circle and wine in the outer circle, or 2 cups, or like there are a number of different ways that it happens. But in that specific thing, like I've been doing communion at home for so long that like everybody has the right elements that they can consume when you do communion at home, because literally it is like whatever you eat. And I just felt so badly. And so like then I was there for 2 Sundays, and the next Sunday I was like, can you tell me like what is what? And so and I did it right after worship. And so then I could tell that person for future reference, this is a situation, but they didn't have it in their bulletin. They didn't like, and I was just like, this is so inhospitable. I felt awful, but also like that congregation clearly was not in the practice of making sure everybody knew what was what and what had what in it. And I think I always feel guilty when I'm in a congregational setting looking for pulpit supply and I give them like this whole huge long email with all of the information, but I want them to not have any questions the day of.
Right.
And so I will give you more information.
Yeah. And I also like to point out, I will tell people that I just flat out don't drink and it's for family history reasons, but I don't go around telling people that, and I will instead try to encourage the providing of non-alcoholic options for both communion and general socialness, just for virtue of like taste. To be honest with you, even if I did drink, I don't think I'd like wine. And
certainly not
even
the
if I liked wine,
in worship.
and even if I liked wine, I don't think I'd want to have a tiny sip of wine in the middle of worship, because what else is going to dry out your throat right before you need to, finish the worship service? That is the worst time to ask the person running the service to drink wine. That is a terrible idea. And so I just genuinely prefer grape juice. For completely unrelated reasons. And since I'm not actually in recovery, I will take wine if I absolutely have to. But teaching people that, no, it's okay to take the grape juice. No, I'm not pregnant. And I don't have to tell you why I'm taking the grape juice is also, I think, part of my job.
Yeah.
But also, the color delineation that you mentioned was interesting to me, Ingrid, because I've grown up with exactly the opposite. The wine is always red and the grape juice is always white. So I don't know what that's about. But
I think Kay, your version is like the connection between like the wine has to be red is because it's magical and it looks more like Jesus' blood if it's red, and then and then the add-on is and then we'll use white so that like people can tell the difference between the two. But like the number
there
of people
are
who
some
have
kinds of
had
Lutherans that
like,
refuse to use grape juice.
Oh, you have to have red because it's the color of blood. No, you don't.
It still doesn't really resemble blood. Like, I hate to tell you guys this, but I have not actually drunk blood. I feel like I have to say that now, but still, no.
Well, it's an interesting thing, and I tend to speak pretty casually and colloquially in church, unless I'm doing pulpit supply in sort of a higher liturgical church, but I usually make reference to the fact that there weren't refrigerators in ancient times, and so they had to have wine, and now with the magic of Welch and the refrigerator, we could just have juice because we don't have to ferment stuff anymore.
Yeah.
Which, did you know, Welch's grape juice was started by a Methodist?
I do know
specifically like for worship.
Methodists love telling people that, and I love that Methodists love telling people that. But
yep, I learned it from a Methodist and told it to other Methodists, which is fun as a Lutheran to do.
So given our gospel reading for today and what we've been talking about, I was wondering, Ingrid, if you had some ideas. If someone is going to an event and is nervous about there being alcohol served there, do you have any favorite suggestions or scripts that they might find useful?
Yeah, so there's two things. One is that if you're feeling anxious in a social situation, do the dishes. That was what my first sponsor told me, and what I think scripture also tells us is like, not necessarily that scripture says go do the dishes, but like to be of service, right? When we don't know what to do, go do something for someone else. And then Isaiah 43 has been something that has been sort of with me in all of my challenging times through, well, even before recovery. Once I became a Christian as a teenager, I always come back to this over and over again whenever I'm feeling nervous, to remind me of who and whose I am. And Isaiah 43 goes, "Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they will not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you will not be burned, and the flames will not consume you, for I am the Lord your God. You are precious in my sight and honored, and I love you." When I remember that I am named and claimed, that I can do anything with God who strengthens me, then I don't have anything to worry about.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Isaiah 43 was one of our readings for our Baptism of Jesus episode last week, which is our episode that came out just before that. this one. So we will link to that in the episode description too. People can check out more ponderings on Isaiah 43.
Sure. But I do love the being of service idea, because not only does it give you something to do, but also you will become popular faster than you ever imagined. So, especially with the person running the show, and that is a great way to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, the be of service is brilliant. So one of the main reasons that we wanted you to be on particularly today is that our gospel reading centers on Jesus' first sign in the Gospel of John, which is turning water into wine at a wedding feast. And so I'm curious how you think about and preach on this story, particularly as someone in recovery, and also as someone who is preaching to a lot of people who are in recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think first and foremost is naming the challenge that's inherent in this story. Like, hey, just a heads up, this isn't like a story about how more wine is the best wine, right? Like, it's not.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. And I think ultimately, like in John, Jesus' signs always point us back to who God is, right? So and what God is up to, what God is like, and to engage us in this, like, see, don't you want to believe kind of thing. And so if we look beyond just the drunkenness of the wedding guests, and if we look at the whole pericope with John-shaped glasses on, I don't know, that's a weird image, but then it reveals like a lot about God. And so if we first name what this isn't, it's easier for us to move into what this is. And it's not, which is primarily not a story about alcoholism, but primarily a story about who God is and what God is up to.
Sure. That's beautiful. I took preaching John in seminary, and one of my professors talked about the Gospel of John as like there's no institution of sacraments in the Gospel of John, because John, like the whole thing is sacramental. So it's this like enticing you and exciting you into, don't you want to know more? Don't you want to become like these possibilities for becoming the sacraments, becoming the elements?
Yeah.
Sure. So, Ingrid, do you have a final, if you can learn any one thing from this deep dive, please know this kind of comment for us?
Yeah, I think probably the takeaway that I would hope in revealing, my wretched past and my my gospel life, my gospel story, is that like nobody has any kind of actual separation from someone who is in active addiction or recovery. Like it used to be back in the day that someone knew someone who knew someone who was a drug addict. And I just don't think that's the case anymore. And
Right.
and so most people wouldn't look at me in the pulpit on a Sunday and categorize me in that way. They wouldn't necessarily look at me in the pulpit on a Sunday with the same look in their eye that they looked at that teenage addict they had to step over to get into the church building, right? But we're the same.
Sure.
We're the same. We're the same beautiful, precious child of God. We are the same named, claimed, called, and chosen, except one of us is still struggling to understand. Well, both of us are still struggling to understand what that means. Let's be real. And so if Jesus calls us to see and serve and love one another as if we are seeing and serving and loving him, then that means like all people, and that if you can hear the gospel from a teenage drug addict on a Sunday, then maybe you can also hear the gospel from a teenage drug addict on a Tuesday morning.
Sure.
Yeah. And so as we dive into our readings for this episode, our first reading is Isaiah chapter 62, verses 1 through 5. Isaiah tells the people that God rejoices over them and delights in them. They will be vindicated in the sight of the nations, and they will rediscover joy. So one of the themes that I noticed in this was this move, right, that God is talking about from cursed to blessed, from cursing to blessing. And spoilers for those of you who have not yet seen Encanto on Disney, which is fantastic. It's not a super spoiler, but in the movie, Mirabel's family, like each person in the family receives some gift that is like like a magical gift, right? Like you're super duper strong, or you can control the weather, or all sorts of things. And Mirabel is the one person in the family who doesn't receive a blessing, like a magical gift. And so a lot of it is her journey of like figuring it out, but this journey of like feeling cursed, like feeling like the one left out of the blessing, and how that happens for her. And I don't know how to like not spoil it, so it's a Disney movie. It always has a happy ending. That's what I will give you.
This
But
is
it's
my shocked face.
right. But yeah, like just thinking about Mirabel's role in the family, and her Tio Bruno also, like both of them have similar roles that would fit well in this theme, this pattern in Isaiah, from cursing to blessing.
Sure.
And then in verse 1, we read, "For Zion's sake, I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake, I will not rest, until her vindication shines out like the dawn, and her salvation like a burning torch." This, I don't know what it is about the imagery of like shining out like the dawn and like a burning torch, makes me think of space exploration, and like probably has something to do with the fact that we're recording the day after Epiphany, and I just finished the Advent movie calendar, and yesterday was outer space, so I watched Interstellar, and watched Black Hole the night before. So I'm just in a like outer spacey mood, but like that image when like spaceships crest and like you can see the sun over the horizon of Earth or like of some other planet.
Sure.
Or like when you see spaceships come out of nowhere, or I don't know. There's like a million different like space scenes that are like all of a sudden this brightness, this like light in the midst of everything.
Yeah, well, when you're in the darkness of outer space, I imagine any light at all is rather more noticeable.
Truth. Yeah.
And then when we reach verse 3, we read, "You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God." So the people of God are not, according to this verse, God's sword or a weapon to fight with. We are not God's armor or shield to protect God, because that's not something God needs.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, we are God's crown or diadem, which I kind of like. It makes me think of the really fantastic crown that the main character wears in Jupiter Ascending during the wedding scene. It's very tall, and it looks like a big wreath of red flowers on her head with branches. And it's probably, I think, my favorite fictional crown because it looks fairly natural rather than trying to look like a very carefully sculpted crown kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose that if God doesn't need us to fight for or protect God, then if we are God's crown, then maybe we are an ornament of beauty to draw attention to God. Is that what a crown does? Maybe if we can draw attention to God, that's us fulfilling our role.
Oh, I just really love Isaiah. Isaiah's the best.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just got to keep coming back here. And I think
there's a lot of good
so
stuff
much good Isaiah. And I always come back because oftentimes I go to Isaiah for comfort, but as like a cis, white, educated person in North America, I'm always like, oh, am I feeling comforted when I should be feeling afflicted right now?
Sure.
Yeah.
But I really dig that image. Thanks for bringing that up. That's going to sit with me for a little while.
Yeah.
And it also tells us that we're beautiful, which doesn't hurt.
It's true. I think about that in terms of like the number of churches that are called Christ the King Church, and
sure,
like that there's a similar like Christ the King Church. My first call was to Christ the King Lutheran Church. But like when it's like a predominantly white congregation and it's called Christ the King, I'm like, should you be talking about power? But like every Cristo Rey, so Christ the King in Spanish, church that I have ever been to or seen is like fantastic, right? But that's from a group of people who are oppressed and marginalized, and like that has a resistive kind of recognition of Christ the King. And so then like to tie in that crown and diadem as like this beauty, particularly like that it is marginalized communities who are the beauty, the crown, the diadem of God.
Yes, absolutely.
I like that.
Which I think is a throwback to the story of St. Lawrence, which is told in the Patreon version of our Epiphany episode.
Yes.
Now that I think about it.
Kay does the editing, so I don't know which makes it and which one necessary.
Yeah, no, that editing our episodes with Jessica Davis is always irritating because I want to keep everything.
Yes, it is hard to get those episodes. But our Patreon episode for Epiphany is up on our Patreon for folks who want to subscribe.
Our second reading for this episode is from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 11. The Church of Corinth, experiencing many varied spiritual gifts from various members, has started arguing that some gifts are more valuable than others. Paul sets them right.
So, one of the kind of obvious themes in this passage is a diversity of gifts. Paul is talking about all sorts of different gifts that people have, and it reminded me of Firefly, particularly the game I have that's based off of the show. But in the game, you need to do different jobs. Like the game is doing different jobs. And so you need different skills and abilities to get the jobs done. So you need like someone who can fight and someone who's a medical person and someone who has tact. And it similarly,
some of those are more common gifts than others.
It's true. And like D&D, it's similar to D&D where you kind of want a variety of different things that people are good at in a campaign, because then different people can shine in different areas. And there's like, I mean, it's the basic idea of like, if everybody lives into their strengths, then my strengths cover somebody else's weaknesses and my weaknesses are covered by somebody else's strengths. Like, we do better when we are more diverse, both in terms of being the people of God and any other time ever, basically.
Yeah, I'd go with that. And then when we read verse 8, we read, "To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit." And I like to point out, almost as often as possible, that the Bible recognizes that knowledge and wisdom are not at all the same thing.
Mm-hmm. So does D&D.
Well, yes, in so many ways. But I recently rewatched the movie Pacific Rim, and there is a character in that movie named Dr. Newton Geisler. I think I'm pronouncing that right. He has a ton of knowledge about these giant monsters that are constantly attacking humanity, but he does not make the best decisions. He puts himself and others in danger on a fairly regular basis, and he winds up saying things like, "Oh, I want to see this giant monster called a kaiju up close one day." And no, that's not actually something you really want to have happen, and he finds that out later. But his knowledge does come in handy on a regular basis, so you have to walk that careful line of the knowledge is useful, but let's have, let's give you a supervisor.
Wisdom on him.
You need a functioning adult in your life. And yeah.
Then in verse 9 and 10, Paul continues to talk about the different gifts of the Spirit, saying, "To another, faith by the same Spirit, to another, gifts of healing by the one Spirit, to another, the working of miracles, to another, prophecy, to another, the discernment of spirits, to another, various kinds of tongues," the languages, not the organs, "to another, the interpretation of tongues." And I feel like this could be a list of like the graces from Graceling, which every time I talk about grace, I love the Graceling books, but I really love that like the powers and like the special things that people are given are called graces, right? That it is this like gift. It is not earned, it's just like bestowed upon the character by nobody knows, they just like magically have it, but like that they could have a variety of graces. So someone could have a grace of prophecy where they can see the future, but also someone could have a grace of like baking really well. There's one of the characters that has a grace of like opening their mouth as big as their head, which is like then calls into question the like if it's a grace of various kinds of tongues, if it could also be a grace of various kinds of bodily functions. I don't know, but
a grace of tongues and a grace of real actual tongues.
Yeah, right? But there's also like the grace of being a really good fighter, or the grace of survival, or the grace of mind reading. Like, there's a million different graces.
Sure.
But I just love that as an example of diversity, particularly because they're all called grace. It's just great.
Yeah. And I think a lot of us, if we were given the option to have a grace, would pick something a lot more normal sounding than people might expect. Like, okay, yes, the grace of being able to fly would be lovely, but on a practical note, I think the grace of like color coordination would come in handy a lot more often. I'm just saying.
The grace
exactly,
of punctuality.
or the grace of punctuation for those who aren't great at grammar. You know,
I
yeah,
know
lots
plenty
of
of people
options.
that wish I had all of those graces. Yeah.
Do you mind if I jump in and just draw attention back to verse 2?
Sure.
I know I'm kind of going in reverse order here, but it just struck me as something that we talked about earlier during the deep dive, and Paul writes, you know that when you were pagans, you were enticed and led astray to idols you could not speak, that could not speak, and that whole idea of being led astray by idols that could not speak just reminds me so much. I mean, I guess of Romans 7 too, but of the notion of all the ways that we are sidelined by 100 different things that aren't Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Our gospel reading for this episode is John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Jesus performs the first of several signs in the Gospel of John at the request of his mother, turning water for ritual washing into fine wine for the end of the celebration of a wedding at Cana. So one of the themes in this passage is celebration. And once again, I just watched Encanto. But the family is so, like, the way the family is depicted from the start of the movie is so much about celebration, right? And they even talk about, like, the gifts that they have to be for the sake of the whole community that was gathered there. And so it's just this, like, so much joy and celebration, and it's Lin-Manuel Miranda's music, and so it's like, it just is fun and fantastic music. And so I'm just like imagining like a wedding at Cana, which I have no idea. Like, I'm not first century Jewish. I don't know what it was like, but the idea of like that it is supposed to be this big celebration and this like whole big thing, whole big party. And Encanto, like, everybody has a part to make it come together.
Sure. When we read verse 3, we hear, when the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. And neither did my wedding. When I was planning my wedding, which was 9 years ago now, I struggled a bit because, as I may have hinted earlier during the deep dive when explaining my historical approach to alcohol, my family has a few issues I wanted to avoid. Yeah, I found the website A Practical Wedding extremely helpful. They had a bunch of examples of helpful ways to address melodramatic or problematic things that could concern you about your wedding. I mean, it used to be a online advice column, basically, much like Captain Awkward or Ask a Manager, which are also things that I'm very fond of. And they eventually published a book, so I haven't read the book, but I imagine it's awesome. But if you want to have a wedding and reception without alcohol, or a similar kind of event, I found that one of the easier ways to do that is to have your wedding reception actually at the church. If you have a church wedding, which often has a no on-site alcohol policy, which I found very helpful myself. We saved money by using the fellowship hall, or whatever they call it, instead of calling it a fellowship hall, instead of having an expensive banquet hall. And there is way less chance for family drama. I'm not going to go into particulars because my family members have access to this podcast. It was a very pleasant wedding, and one of the first times that one of my very close relatives did not create a scene at a wedding in living memory. Some of those scenes were hilarious, to be fair, but not all of them were. And as it worked out, we did have the occasional small group of people sneak out to the bar that was a block down the street, and then they would come back. But that just gave us time to circulate among the different groups anyway, and because they knew they had to come back and then drive home later, they didn't actually drink that much, and it wasn't a big deal. So if you wanted to know if that's possible, now you know.
Also, then you can spend your money on a root beer keg and get some real nice root beer. That's what my best friend did.
I don't remember. I mean, we had a variety of beverages. I don't remember what they were, but the pulled pork we had for catering was fantastic. So
I will take your word on that. I am vegetarian, so
yes.
Kay does the dead animal eating, and I do the plant eating.
I also do the plant eating.
I also occasionally do plant eating. Like, I'm not actually a carnivore. That would be my cat.
Not exclusively.
Yeah, not exclusively.
Before we jump into the next verse, I kind of want to just stay on Mary for a minute. Mary has been like relentlessly pursuing me through Advent and now into Christmas and Epiphany. I'm like, Mary, leave me alone. And so when I was reading this, doing preparation, it was Mary who once again sort of leapt out of my Bible and got me again. And she, I think again here she displays for me her compassion in the lack. Not that everybody needs wine to have a party, right? That's not what my point is.
Yeah.
That like she sees lack and she feels compassion and is moved to action, right? Like, oh, Mary, once again. And again, just her faithfulness in Jesus. You know, from the very beginning, she says yes, and then she just keeps saying yes.
She is the one who is so active in saying yes to God and continuing to pursue the call from God. And it baffles my mind. I mean, I know how it happens, patriarchy and all of those things, but it just baffles my mind how many people think that she's like meek and mild when like there is no scriptural evidence for that whatsoever. Like,
no, it's like the Mary and Elizabeth revolution.
Yep.
Yeah. I've always wanted to take a look at the Christmas carol that calls her meek and mild and ask myself, are the rest of these verses also wildly sarcastic?
Ooh.
But I've never gotten around to it because that seems like an option.
Huh. Yeah, now I want to do that too. Like, Yeah, and then in verse 6, we read, "Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And this feels like a much exaggerated version of when the hobbits are at the Prancing Pony, I believe, and Mary comes back with a pint of beer, and Pippin is like, "They come in pints?" And is like blown away and then immediately has to go get a pint. So that's like a half pint to a pint, which is double the size. But this is like 20 or 30 gallons. This is such a huge amount, like mind-blowing amount for Jesus to just be like, here you go, 6 of these, right? Like 180 gallons. That is so much. And it is about like providing when, as you were saying, right, Mary notices that there is none. And so it is providing when there is none, and that space of abundance and of care in the community.
Yeah. So, Ingrid, do you have any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
That's a big question. So, how long have you got? No, I'm just kidding. Really, here's my church nerd. I'm so excited that there's people who talk about these things and like, I don't know you two, and you're far away from me. Like I'm over here on the west coast of Canada, and we get to share in faith, and we get to share in exploration, and we get to, I don't know. It always makes me so happy when I see other people who are actively loving the world. And so I guess thanks.
Yeah, thank you for being with us. It has been a fun
thank you.
A fun conversation and a gift for me as like a pastor and sometimes worship leader, but also just like to be in this space and be able to talk about stuff that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 3rd Sunday after Epiphany. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax
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 vobiscum.
vobiscum.